and welcome to Thinking Aloud. My guest in this episode of Thinking Aloud is Chris Brookman. Good morning, Chris. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. How are you doing?
It's afternoon now, isn't it? Because it's 1 minute past 12. Anyway, listen, I've penned a little introduction because to get things going about you, and I'm just going to read it to you. So try not to be too flattered, but
Right.
and obviously correct me if I've got anything wrong as we go along. But I'm joined by Chris today, who I've known for a long, long time, something like 20 years I worked out. He's the founder and managing director of Back to Earth, a company that's been at the forefront of sustainable building materials and sustainable building since 1995. Chris started with a degree in chemistry, but quickly moved to a slightly more unconventional path, setting up the building company and working with natural materials. Basically, we'll have a chat about this. I'm sure it's going to crop up: cob, lime. And what followed from that was a unique, almost a unique blend of science, experimentation, practical knowledge, and to some extent philosophy, which we'll dig into, no doubt, Chris. By 2007, Back to Earth had evolved into a specialist material supplier, so supplying high performance products, typically based around sustainability and energy efficiency. And Chris's main focus, I think it's fair to say, Chris, would be fabric first as your approach. So if you get the building envelope right, then everything else tends to follow. So beyond Back to Earth, Chris is, and this is one of the things I want to explore with us today, Chris, but a natural teacher. I think it's fair to say you're a very good communicator. And whether that's through CPDs, site visits, exhibitions and shows, but also the Fibres Academy, which I'm sure you're going to let us know about, and the work you've done there. So all focused on breaking down complex ideas and helping people think differently about building. So I think your ability to guide and inspire is a huge part of what makes Back to Earth a successful business. So we are today going to look through this. I've got a series of questions for you, Chris. It's all, and please don't let this be too formal, but I just thought I'd begin by asking you how you started. I mean, the link between your academic beginnings in chemistry, learning chemistry, and the building isn't a natural progression necessarily.
No, that was definitely a knee jerk. But yeah, thank you for that introduction. That was literally the most flattering introduction I've ever had. Thank you. Yeah, it's kind of interesting how when I first started in work, I kind of, there was work life and there was personal life, and the two kind of just go along and they don't necessarily cross, and you have a fairly linear kind of work life and your personal life doesn't necessarily interact with it. That was my bizarre thinking when I first left university, I think. But the interaction of your personal life with your working life was really what steered me through where I've gone. And by the time I left university, I'd been in education for 17 years or something. I guess I'm a sort of physical person. I like doing physical stuff. I did a few summers in labs as sort of work experience, and it was by a long shot some of the most boring experiences I've ever had. So the thought of leaving university and going into working in a lab was absolutely
no appeal to you,
absolutely none. Yeah,
well, 17 years was plenty long enough. So
well,
what prompted the move into this practical, and using the skills you'd acquired?
It was a real knee jerk from right. I've had enough of education. I want to do something practical. My dad had bought this old cob house. He was looking for someone to rebuild this cob barn, and there was a guy called Kevin McCabe who still actually is doing cob now. And I went and did a little bit of training with him and sort of learned the basics of how to put it all together, and absolutely loved doing it. So I rebuilt this barn for my dad, and it was a great experience. Doing something practical with your hands, really, and learning something as well. Because when you're in university, you're in the habit of learning stuff. When you're in education, you're in the habit of learning stuff, which actually you quite quickly get out of. And so that was a great, really enjoyable thing to do as well. Learn all about, cob and how it varies, all the different constituents, the different styles, the different soil types. I was a proper soil geek for quite a long time. Probably still am. I'm generally pretty geeky, to be
I
fair.
haven't noticed any soil geekiness since I've known you.
That's just because you haven't spoken to me about much cob.
So you were, but so your dad's bought this place and you've got involved in this. You got practical. So when did that translate into doing some work for yourself? Because didn't that then become effectively you as Chris Brookman builder?
Well, that was it. So, I built that place. I went back and worked for Kevin McCabe for about 9 months or a year or something. And again, really got into it, really enjoyed it. And then actually began to sort of look broader than that and began to find work around where I was living. And there were an awful lot of cob buildings around there. So I sort of started speaking to people locally and getting small bits of work and
this was all where you live. This is all West Country, yeah.
Yeah, this is all near Oakhampton at the time, and so we're getting more and more projects around there. I was also working with a lady called Jill Smallcombe, who was also sort of involved in that scene, and to be fair, had been involved in it for a bit longer than I had. And between us, we kind of worked together for a while and sort of found projects, and then everything just snowballed. A lot of I always feel like I've been pretty lucky with the timing of a lot of the stuff that I've done, because it's sort of come at a time when there's interest in whatever it is I'm doing. So yes, obviously, you had to promote stuff and you have to get out there and tell people what you're doing and try and sell it to some extent. But if there's a momentum already carrying you along, it's a hell of a lot easier than if you're fighting the tide of everything else.
I'm interested in the luck thing because I do think that people underestimate luck. I think it does play quite a significant part in a lot of people's, stories and journeys. The other thing that kind of intrigues me about this is how come there was so much cob work around at the time? I mean, it's not the most prevalent building system in the UK. It's fairly geographically, limited to certain areas. And I mean, where I'm based down in East Sussex, and apart from rammed earth, there's people who ram buildings with chalk. I think probably Pines Calyx in Dover is probably the best example of that I can think of that's got a profile. But who were all these people? Because they don't seem to be around now. I mean,
there was a lot. I mean, all around the kind of West Country, Exeter and Southwest, there is a lot of cob, and there are real pockets of buildings, hundreds and hundreds of years old, and people. It was at a time when there were sort of local organisations promoting doing the right thing with them, using lime on them, not just covering them up with sand and cement and trying to forget about them and chicken wire and whatever else people used to use. And so there was that interest. So there just weren't enough people to service the demand for it or the interest in it.
Do you think that skill set's died out now?
No, not at all. There are more and more people doing it. It's still relatively niche. I mean, certainly, the one thing that I've always, and I know you talk about this a bit more later on, but the one thing I used to be afraid of, but now actually I'm more enjoying, is being in this tiny, tiny little niche. And when you're in those niches, potentially there's an awful lot of things to do and projects to look at.
So you were going along merrily doing the cob work because you were blessed with local capacity that you could meet and demand that you could meet. But then you started that transition from acquiring practical skills, working on site, and just learning all the things that actually are important. And I think a lot of people who are a little bit distanced from it forget what happens on site, especially some of the practical things. Yeah. But you then moved into a bit like the start of Eco Merchant, where Joe Wild, who started it, couldn't find the materials he wanted, could only buy in bulk, sold off the surplus, and then found that he was actually not only a self-builder but a merchant. But you started to move into the construction supply market. Let's move on to that, where that started to happen. I suppose the most obvious question is the one that I think faces an awful lot of us, which is you have a receptive audience. You've got a cob style market. It's just broader for more natural and sustainable materials. Yeah. But the rest of the market is genuinely skeptical about all of this. So when you started this, is that something that you acknowledged? You were thinking, actually, I've got to address this.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I guess looking back, I probably had thicker skin than I thought, and because again, most people looked at what I was doing and what others were doing as yeah,
So
not
it's a
exactly
brand thing,
equal,
isn't it?
but
If the guy who comes and does the line looks like Catweasel and mixes it in a bath with a stick, you kind
yeah,
of think that's okay, that's trad, and then that's
yeah,
heritage.
exactly. That
You
sort
know,
of
but if he pitched up in a German branded boiler suit with a stick rule, foldable stick rule, and lots of fancy machine, you'd be thinking, hang on a minute, this doesn't
exactly
quite.
that.
But
And that's what it was like. That there was a lot of skepticism from general builders, and again, that's where the desire to educate people came from. It's the lack of understanding of what they were actually working with was always the problem. If you don't know what you're working with, you just apply, what you do know to it and hope that it works. But yeah, and that was part of the sort of slow integration with what we were doing, and the growth in the general market. Again, it wasn't just us there. There were three or four other biggish companies at the time doing similar things, and they were we were all thankfully growing nicely because the market just kept expanding.
so you I mean, so what do you think were the biggest challenges that you faced when you were introducing products? Like wood fiber, or I mean, lime less so because lime's been around for a long time and people are kind of used to it. But
Mm.
the natural insulation products. I mean, insulation wasn't a thing. I mean, I grew up I was a young child in the '60s. We didn't have insulation in the house. I don't think we even had loft insulation. So, I don't think I think Celotex didn't even have I think Celotex built their first factory in the late '70s in the UK.
Yeah.
So
So it was again in hindsight, I wouldn't necessarily have said it at the time, but in hindsight, we were kind of introducing it to a receptive audience, to the more traditional, historic building market, and they were more interested in using natural materials because natural materials were used in the buildings already. And again, that market was developing at the time. There were more younger architects learning about all that sort of ideology is not the right word, but that's those kind of products and
methodology, maybe.
methodology. Yeah, that's a better word. So there was a lot of interest in it, and bit by bit, the market grew. More people were interested in it. The understanding of it still wasn't there, and understanding the benefits of it weren't necessarily there. So we introduced these materials slowly, but where we could sort of shoehorn them into a project, we would. Because we knew that they were going to work better and they were going to give people a more comfortable experience. But to be fair, at that point, I didn't know that much about the products. I hadn't really had a light bulb moment and thought, hold on, I should be looking at all the data on these products. Why am I going with what people say? Because there's so much of
There
that
is.
in the building industry is just, oh, he said it does this, so it does that.
So the market. I mean, the interesting thing is that to me is that it sounds to me as though your market was principally people who were associated with some kind of heritage, whether
Yeah.
that there was the building they were living in, whether it was they still had relatives or knowledge of people who used traditional crafts and skills, which would have been non-chemical. They would have been, they would have been lime, timber, etc. So you're moving into that area. That this journey as well, well, just think back what kind of standard houses we were building in the '70s and '80s. Think of any housing estates near you, and you think what was built, what was put up in the '70s and '80s, and a lot of the retrofit work we're doing on is solid wall construction. So we know that was done before, let's just say 1910, for example, or the turn of the early part of the 20th century.
Mm.
So I mean, I'm sure we're seeing between the two of us, and I'm sure you've been instrumental in this, in a move into more modern methods of construction and away from the heritage side. So when you looked at products using your sort of scientific background, were you then looking at it with a view to not just the heritage market? You were looking at expanding it out, and how? So what did you learn when you looked at that, and how did that process work?
I'd been doing the cob building for, I don't know, 7, 8 years or something like that, and actually the kind of knee jerk to pull away from academia went the other way. And so I began to really look at those materials, and again, because actually that naturally that is me. and so I began to actually find the data on them, find the data on all sorts of materials.
Could you find it?
Yeah, because the Europeans are brilliant at producing the data. In England, we produce a product, we try and sell it to everyone, and then go, "Oh yeah, we've got." I'll
You
try
need
and
to
find
know what.
exactly that. We're good at trying to sell the product before, and you know exactly what it does. Um, and so, yeah, a lot of that data was there. It just needed turning into something that people could understand and not so much could understand, but could actually see a benefit from. Because that's basically what I try and do, is to find products that I can see a clear benefit for and actually introduce that to people. And so after the cod building, I was becoming less, well, I was certainly enjoying building a lot less. Again, this is where the kind of personal life comes in. I had our first son who was disabled, who needed a lot of care. I couldn't put all my energy into being on site and lumping cob around all day and all the physicality of being a builder. So I had to really change slightly what I was doing, and so and that's when I began to look at those products, and that's what gave me the opportunity really to start looking at actually selling the products as a separate business. I thought it'd be a great idea to run two businesses, because that's what all successful people do. They have two businesses. Apparently, it's quite difficult.
Depends how you define success as well.
Yeah.
You've reminded me of some research that we did years and years and years ago, and we looked at levels of self-build and custom build by country across Europe. And there were some people who were alarmingly high. So from memory, I think that Austria had something like 60% of all new builds were custom or self-build. Wow. And guess where we were in the UK? Right down the bottom. So I was asked, as part of this research, I went to look at all the countries where we sourced and bought materials. And guess what? The higher the level of custom and self-build within that country, the more suppliers I was looking at, which meant inevitably that the number of suppliers in the UK was small. I mean, I think still today we struggle with finding UK suppliers of a lot of the products that we're interested in, which, bearing in mind what you said earlier on, is a bit bonkers, because we obviously have this heritage of building. We have skilled craftsmen, we built in a particular way. And then we sort of abdicated it to some sort of consumerist way of building. My least favorite feature of modern construction is shareholder value. But, so where did you go? How did you, so I presume you're not a polyglot and that you don't speak 8 or 9 languages. So what were you doing? Ringing up companies in France and Germany and going, "Excuse me, I'd like to buy some stuff."
Well, that, again, this is where luck comes in. I went to I think it was the second eco build, and I met a couple of people there who sort of introduced me to 2 or 3 suppliers, mostly in Germany, all of whom spoke wonderful English. And again, they have that sort of technical, they had that technical understanding that what I wanted to learn. And so, yeah, that made the transition far easier. They gave me access to all of these different materials. I could see that there were real benefits from, using the clay boards. Wood fiber is the main bulk of what we do, because it's a massive industry in Europe, and it's quite an established industry. And because of that, you've got all the data, you've got, really good data, you've got really good case studies, you've got a good understanding of how it affects buildings and the benefits that it can bring. So again, I was able to sort of incorporate all of that. And the other thing is climate change obviously is coming further and further up the agenda. There is, and now I'm 50, it's really nice to see younger architects coming in who've got this real drive to change things. And whilst I might try and take credit for getting it out there, those younger architects who've got that sort of drive to change things and change the way we do things, I couldn't do it without them. They're the ones who are incorporating it into projects. Quite a lot of people, worked on their own project first and sort of, worked out that, whatever it is that we're whatever specification we've given them actually is pretty good, and they'll start introducing that to their customers as well. So yeah, that's what I mean about luck. We were lucky that at the time that I was transitioning from building into materials, there was also this drive for different materials, but also there was the government funding that was available at the end of the noughties, which sort of created this artificial bubble, but nonetheless there was a sort of a positive residue from that bubble, in that more and more people knew about a whole variety of different materials.
So what was it? What were the products you went for first? Because I mean, like a lot of us, I mean, you can break it down to category: insulation, surface materials, boards, etc. I mean, neither of us supply bathrooms or kitchens or anything else. We're effectively what we sell at Back to Earth and what we sell at Eco-Merchant are largely building shell products. So what were the ones you started with? Did it just sort of was it self-evident that it's got to be building boards, insulation, and finishes?
No, not at all. Sort of the mid noughties, I suppose. So about 2002, 2003 is when I started really looking into these materials. And, I didn't know much about airtightness. I hadn't really considered airtightness at that point. I knew the basics of insulation, but, very little really. And so, started learning about all of that. And then, yeah, kind of moved on from there really. Yeah.
I mean, the point I'm getting at is that you've moved into this market. You want to sell materials.
Yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing is, so that you were about acquiring knowledge about these things. What you wanted with your chemistry brain was data. I'm interested to know how you wanted to interpret that and use it. I mean, there isn't. I love this one that I heard years. I've just remembered it actually, which is knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, and wisdom is not using it in a fruit salad. there's a point to be made about this. You can collect all this data, but you've then got. I mean, I've mentioned this to you before about the Ansoff model, but which describes the challenge that you have when you're selling a material. So you tell an existing product to an existing customer is the easiest sell. Then a new product to an existing customer. You end up with a new product to a new customer, and that's where you started. So this uphill struggle to get people. So how did you do this?
So yeah, I mean, because of all the years of lime plastering that I've been doing, sort of taking on board the Baumet products was the first step really. Like I say, understanding the boards and the airtightness came second to that. We used the Baumet products in the building company. So again, I had some good practical experience of doing that. And then again, on more heritage building, I mean, the heritage market is a really useful point for transition, because you can take these sort of relatively modern materials, but with the benefits of the historic materials, and apply them to historic buildings, but using modern builders, because they know how to pick a bag up and stick it in a render sprayer and spray it on the wall. They don't really need to know that actually it's lime based and it's very breathable and it does all the things that it can do. So yeah, we started out with those plasters. That was the first thing. We were also quite involved in hempcrete, so we built quite a few hempcrete buildings in the building business. And again, there was a lot of interest in hempcrete at the time. And so that kind of got us into various different architectural practices. And we kind of combined the hempcrete, the wood fiber, and the lime as a kind of, an alternative set of offerings, and that piqued people's interest. And I guess there was a lot of focus on locking up carbon or embodied carbon at that point, because I think some of the government funding was at the time was sort of promoting that. And then reusing brickwork. So you use lime mortar, so you can actually get the brickwork apart. There was a lot of interest in reducing the embodied or rather the impact of construction at that time. And so that's what enabled us to pique the interest of the bigger architectural practices.
And were you still working in that sort of niche market, which is the kind of building selects itself for the materials that you're doing, or were you getting people going, actually, hang on a minute, we could use this elsewhere. And if they were doing that, how did you support them in that transition? Because you've now got to get all the knowledge that you've acquired to make sure they're not putting tomatoes in fruit salad. You know,
yeah, well, exactly that. And so that was the thing at that time, sort of, 2010, 2012, 2013, there were some quite large projects around that were interested in using, lime mortars as an alternative. And that enabled us to sort of, get a foot in the door because of the building experience that I'd had for the last, whatever it was, 13, 14 years. And that I'd actually physically been using a lot of the materials. I could support the architects in, in actually designing it and detailing it.
What were you supporting them with, Chris? That's a bit intrigues me. I mean, were you doing calculations for them? Were you? I mean, the Woofy wasn't around in those days. No. we didn't have the various tools that we have now.
Well, no, but it's just simple detailing. It's architects have got so much to consider when they're designing a building. I wouldn't expect them to know the intricacies of an external wall insulation and to understand well, not to understand, but to remember all the detailing that is required. So it was a case of just going through, basic detail drawings and actually saying, well, hold on, if you change this to this, it'll be watertight, or if you leave it as it is, it's probably not going to be watertight, things like that. But yeah, mostly detailing support with architects at that point.
This might sound a little bit trivial, but I'm convinced that it's true as well. And that is that one of the other issues that we have with European products is their European branding. These are not recognized brands in the UK. And people like Baumit, who are, again, we're a reseller of Baumit, sell a lot of it. We do have the comedy moment when someone tries to pronounce one of the product names. But it doesn't help, does it, when you have a really bonkers name to a product made by someone you've never heard of? I mean, did that present itself as a barrier as well, where, going back to this new products to new customers? So you're saying to someone, I can make you technically aware about this product you're going to have a problem pronouncing, okay? But you've never heard of them, although they might be a huge company in Austria or Germany, but we've never heard of them.
Yeah.
And you kind of default, because I'm interested in the way people read this. I mean, I do complain sometimes that we've been over scientified, or whatever the word is. That there's too much science and there's not enough. And this is kind of what the whole of thinking aloud's about, because in order to get people to think about things differently, you have to approach. You can't just send them a whole bunch of figures and numbers and say, now change.
No.
How did you find that process, and how did you begin? How did you unlock this and begin to unlock it?
I guess that is what we do as a supplier, whether we're supposed to or not. But and that was the bit that I enjoyed, was translating the science into the practicalities, doing the kind of sciencey stuff behind the scenes.
Can you give us some examples, or how your thinking went like that? Maybe one of the anecdotes you might use to convince an architect or a specifier or a building client or a client.
I mean, the process that we go through, we do all the kind of number crunching in the background so that it's simple for the architect and it's simple for the builder. So if we can take the risky bit out of, one of the risky bits anyway, out of, from the market, as it were. Because basically, I do feel like there's a massive lack of understanding in the market of actually how complex buildings are. There's a kind of builders are kind of underplayed a bit and potentially put down by I don't know, people who are in theory more educated, and actually there should be more understanding, and potentially there is more understanding out there than is acknowledged. But anyway, so we take that sort of sciencey bit out. We do all the calculations, so it might be woofy. In the early days, it would have just been U-value calculations and checking the detail and following manufacturer's guidance. And yeah, Brexit was a good one for that. And then converting that into something that an architect can understand, that they can put forward to a client, that they can see the benefits of, and then having a simple solution for the builder to install.
I think the builder thing's the bit that I'm intrigued by, because which another one of my pet peeves is people, I think the modern expression is dissing builders. These are people who are capable. They're like sponges when it comes to skill. I remember going on.
They learn differently.
They learn differently. And that's the kind of thing when I've been down to visit you and when I've been, I remember going on to it was for Pro Climber actually, or Pro Clima, some people call it. But anyway, and we were in Ireland at a trade thing. And one of the guys had built a little coffin out of some bit of scrap plywood, and it had a little 2x1 surround by it, which was literally a centimetre shorter than the roll. And he was on a scaffold putting it on a ceiling. And what he did was he dropped it in and pulled it out like a cling film dispenser, and it could have rolled in the little coffin. And then he could use the timber across the edge to cut it with a knife. That was more instructive than half the stuff we learned, the maths that we learned about diffusivity, okay, most of which went over my head. So I think it's sort of like, you have to address the audience you're speaking to. But did you find that your practical, when people learned that you were a builder, they approached you slightly differently, and you had access in a different way?
Certainly the guys on site, yeah, definitely, because you can speak the language, and speaking as an architect, you might talk in one way, but builders do speak differently and understand things differently. And having that experience of being on site was absolutely invaluable. I mean, there were guys who sort of people that I've been to school with who were like, "What the hell are you doing as a builder? You were the academic amongst us all. Why are you building?" But actually, having that building experience was I couldn't do what I do now without it. So it was absolutely invaluable. But just really learning hands-on about how a building goes together is so important if you're really going to design buildings, and certainly if you're going to tell people how to do building work, whether it's retrofit or building new buildings, whichever.
I think that's an interesting point, because I mean, if you just take something obviously like a car, which is an incredibly complex thing. I mean, it was one thing that intrigues me about cars is the best quote. One of the quotes I use a lot was from a guy called Kumar Galhotra, who was the president of Lincoln Motors, who described car making as 100,000 rational decisions in search of one emotional one.
Yeah,
I think that's very true about buildings as well. And one of the things, because you've done loads of videos, if you find yourself on YouTube, you're always there with your overalls on, doing the practical stuff. And I mean, maybe you're convinced of this, obviously, but I just think that really works. And it doesn't matter whether you're an architect or a builder or not. The practical side of it, seeing the little tricks, everybody loves learning about those things, don't they?
Yeah,
they like seeing it. Are you still doing those, by the way? You still?
I have had a bit of a hiatus in that we just haven't had the time recently to do it, but we will start doing it again at some point. But again, it was part of that original sort of instruction, just to document all the building skills that I had then, which have probably waned a little bit now because that was like 12 years ago or something. But just to get that information out there that anyone could use, and just demystify the whole thing. So whether you're an architect or a builder, you can look at that and actually understand it, and then either install it better or design with it better. Because as you say, the weird and wonderful names that some of these products have put people off potentially on one hand, but equally depending on the client, some people love the fact that it comes from Germany, particularly because the Germans are very good at engineering, all this sort of stuff, is the sort of whatever.
But this is the thing about stereotypes and brands and everything. Everything conveys messages. You think German, we all think Vorsprung Durchtechnik because that's the way we brought it up. But what you think is technical. And you think if you're French, you think might be more artisan, a bit more flair. But what intrigues me is that you've ended up acting like some sort of weird Babel fish that translate both ways. From sort of, so builders you can talk to a builder in their own language, an architect in their own language. They don't need to learn the other's language; they just need to have you in the middle doing it for them. So tell me. So this one of the things this ended up with, Chris, was the Fibres Academy. Tell us about the Fibres Academy and how it came to, because this was, I think, was the ultimate sort of midway point between practicality and by the way, I did do the quiz on it and bombed. I didn't get my diploma. I tried it 3 times, and we sell them.
Well, again, it's just trying to get all that information out there that anyone can access at any point. and trying to make it as accessible as possible in terms of not just all text. There's some video and content and drawings and stuff as well. But the more people can understand it, the more we can grow the market. The more we can grow the market, the more we can change the direction of the broader market and the bigger impact we can have. So.
It's still going, the Fibres Academy, isn't it? So
yeah. No,
yeah. So you better give people the address so they can go and log on to it.
You should be able to just Google Fibres Academy, but yeah, it's really just about getting all that information out of my head so that I can hopefully reach a broader audience, rather than just sort of one phone call at a time about how do you do this, how do you do that, how do you do the other. And again, when you're on site, you don't necessarily want to have to phone people. If you've got access to a 3D model or a drawing of something you can quickly look at, and then because again, as I was saying, builders generally, a lot of builders are visual learners, and they can look at a drawing and just like that, they know exactly what it is. And that translation, if you'd given them a load of text, or some people, if you give them a load of text, it's quite difficult to translate that into a practical thing. So the more different forms of information we can get out there, hopefully the more people can understand it and use it. And again, of any brand, I'm not trying to just do it for back to earth. I'm trying to do it for anyone, really.
No, I think that was what we all liked about the Fibres Academy. So let me get this right. So the Fibres Academy was principally a mechanism for broadening the reach of wood fibre insulation or natural fibre insulation in the marketplace. And it's been, from what we've said before, you've been telling me, it's been pretty successful. You've had lots and lots of people through it. And do you know who they were? Were they mainly architects? Is that who?
There's quite a big mix, actually. I mean, it's as you would expect, it's architects, self-builders, and builders. There's a lot of architects, some self-builders, and quite a lot of builders. So the other thing that we have recently incorporated is a sort of a formal course to go through for one of our internal wall insulation systems, again, so that people can do it in their own time, so that we've got a bit of confidence that when we're sending a product to site, I know that the guys on site have actually gone through some sort of instruction on how to install the product. And again, it's not I'm trying to catch people out or anything. I'm generally trying to make sure they understand it so they can install it properly, so that the project does what it's supposed to do, rather than 6 months down the line someone's complaining that there's a bit missing and there's draft and all the usual problems that you get.
Well, I mean, I think the performance gap applies to any kind of building, doesn't it? I mean, yeah. you can build naturally with a performance gap, and you can build synthetically with a performance gap. Yeah. But I think what you're doing will help close that gap if people are. I mean, this is another thing which I think the Fibres Academy addresses, in the way you've approached it, is that how stuff is put into a building is critically important. There's a big difference between doing the numbers on paper in a swish office in downtown Exeter, near where you are, and somebody on a cold winter's morning trying to fit insulation into a building on site when it's raining and they want to get home early. Yeah. So there's you've got this, and so this is another thing with products, isn't it? Products that are easier to use, presumably the inference is that they lead to fewer mistakes.
Absolutely, and that again is one of the prerequisites when we're sourcing materials. Is thankfully I did that stint of building, so I can usually look at a product, understand how it's installed, and see if I think that's going to be viable.
You still do. I mean, going back to the ProClimber thing, I can remember one of the things that we looked at is the number of 3 meter rolls that we sell is almost nil. Why? Because have you ever used one on site? A 3 meter long roll. I don't know how much it weighs, but it's going to be, it's going to be an awful lot.
Yeah.
And just cumbersome. Yeah. So just the practical stuff you do. So I'm intrigued by that a little bit about the sourcing. So when you look at without a view to a market, so you're not trying to satisfy pre-existing demand, but when you've looked at things like clayboard, you've recently looked at thin form insulation. Tell us about some of the products you've been looking at, and what goes through your sort of your criteria of choice before you would take a product on.
Because you know, when we first started out, yeah, we were just selling insulation materials. Where as time went on, and certainly when Brexit happened. So with Brexit, as an importer, you effectively become the manufacturer. So irrespective of anything, if there's a problem with it, it's your problem. It's not the manufacturer's problem, it's your problem. And actually, that gave me the opportunity to sort of revise things a bit and actually apply our understanding to specifications. So we kind of morphed into creating specifications, not always following the manufacturer's guidance, because again, as time goes on, you realize that some manufacturers don't necessarily understand their products as well as you think they might. And so, you know, we've created a lot of our own specifications, not everything. I mean, quite a few of our systems are based on exactly what the
So
manufacturer.
give me an example of a specification and what might be in there.
Well, that nature wall system that we've created. So that was the combination of needs, basically. One was from Cambridge University, where they didn't want lime plaster on the walls because it doesn't come off very easily. So we used a clay-based plaster with it. A project that we were doing up in Northampton, where it was they wanted the wood fibre, but they also wanted a more sort of commercial aspect to it, in that they wanted to run lots of services through the insulation, which if you just put wood fibre boards on the wall, you're going to hack them to bits and change, you know, make a real mess of it. So again, that's and then finishing with plasterboard. And again, if I'd listened to what everybody else said, I would assume that plasterboard's not breathable and it is literally the spawn of the devil.
Go on, have a go with the plasterboard. I enjoy this when you get, because I'm with I'm unapologetically with you on this one. I don't see plasterboard as the devil incarnate, but just expand on that a little bit.
Well, so again, you know, so we've put this spec together based on our understanding of the materials, using design tools like Woofy, and then incorporating practical aspects for the guys on site. And again, if you give them a plasterboard, they can skim it and plaster it. If you say you've got a lime plaster, it's like, you know, where am I going to find a specialist to do that? So so it's that kind of thing, really. If you put those materials together and package it up in something that's palatable, you know, people will run with it. But yeah, that sort of change was a kind of pivotal point where we started creating these specifications, and then we looked at what other products were around, really to suit the specifications that we were producing. You know, we know that the scenarios that we've got coming in, where people say, I've got this scenario, you know, how can I insulate it? And wood fibre will do quite a lot of it. It certainly doesn't do all of it. And so each time, you know, we're looking around for different products that will fill a niche. We're not bringing stuff in because there's a demand for it. We bring it in because we can incorporate it into a spec and then slowly.
So you're, in many ways, you're creating a demand, because I think,
oh, yeah,
you know, that one of the biggest issues I think that we all face with UK construction, if your ambition is to grow the sustainable market, is the natural resistance that the market presents in itself, which might be, you know, the developer-led market, shareholder value driving business behavior. We've always done it this way. There's a whole bunch of stuff. So I'm intrigued as to how we can, and how you view the idea of the options to get broader uptake with this, because you kind of be forgiven for thinking a lot of this is just niche problems. You then become the provider of last resort. We don't know what to do. Chris Brookman will. Okay, but actually, a lot of this is about getting this into more because a lot of the systems that you're using, a lot of the approaches that you have, if you have that kind of just add water approach to the product, so you simplify it, this should be more adoptable. I'm intrigued to know what your view might be on why it's not, because we're still a very small percentage of the market with the natural and sustainable materials.
I think there's various reasons. One is the understanding of the products, that so taking time to really understand the product and how it works and where it can be used is one thing. We're in a pretty litigious culture, so people are very afraid to say, okay, the manufacturer says you can use it there, but I'm going to say you can use it there. Oh, you know, it's painful doing that. because maybe you don't understand the product well enough to know exactly where it can be used. So yeah, and then and also, as you say, the momentum behind a style of construction. You know, if 95% of our houses are built by 4 companies or 6 companies, whatever it is, that doesn't leave a big market for variation. Although, you know, having said that, we do have millions of houses that need rather more complicated retrofitting. So yeah, I think those are the sort of barriers, is that sort of initial momentum. But I think if there was more understanding, more people sort of really training up on materials, we would get sort of a broader scope of where different materials can be used, and also, you know, bringing different materials in without necessarily the expectation that, you know, you're going to make a load of money out of it. We don't bring the products in because we think, oh, we're going to make a load of money out of those. We bring them in because there's a little niche or there's an issue that we can't solve currently, and with that product we can solve it, and then, you know, and that's our specification sort of moving forward.
I mean, I think there is a reluctance against, and a perception issue here as well, to accept that these are somehow viable, you know, provable, you know, working solutions. There's a natural thing. Well, it's got to work better than that because it's made of plastic. You know, it couldn't possibly do it. And, you know, so there's all of this going on. I mean, it does intrigue me, because the refurbishment market in particular is massive for all of us, because so many of the buildings were built in a manner that require them to be vapor open, for example, or to be differently. So it's how we address that, I think, that is the biggest challenge that we've got, isn't it? Because you can stuff people full of knowledge and learning, but they've got to be able to deploy it. Yeah. So I think we've got to come up with some kind of other messaging that says, you know, that ends up with the same effect, but achieves it differently. And that's what I think a lot of what you do, because it's practically rooted, actually is successful in doing. So all of this ends up with you where you are now. I wanted to just explore to you just a little bit about fabric first, and about how important it is, and passive as well, because you've built your own passive house. You've got your own little badge outside the front door, Chris.
Very expensive piece of plastic. Yeah, again, that was personal life and work life overlapping. If you're in a wheelchair and you don't move a lot, you need to be in a warm environment to stay warm. So we built the house around my son. And that was the kind of motivator to really go headlong into passive house and really understand it. And actually, I think there's a bit of sort of mystery around passive house, that you know, it's this really difficult thing, and expensive and complicated, and, you know, all the kind of bad things that you don't really want in construction. But it really isn't. So the guys that get trained up by the Passive House Institute to be passive house designers, that's the complex bit, you know, so you understand how to design a building and all that kind of thing. But assuming they do their job properly, the actual construction of passive houses is, you know, really not that difficult. The walls might be a bit thicker than you usually build walls. Everything is probably on a slightly thicker scale, but the complexity is no different to any other passive house. So that's what I kind of learned out of that, really. You know, there were various details and things like that I hadn't come across before, that I now have an understanding of. But it really helped sort of take the mystery out of passive house and actually convey that then to other people and say, look,
where do you think the mystery came from? Because it's a non-UK standard.
German, isn't it?
German, isn't it? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, and also the people that do it, you know, you've got a 100-page spreadsheet to fill out to assess your building. You know, you've got to do a lot of stuff. You've got to be diligent. You've got to do this, that, and the other. So
they can run the numbers and check it all works. But I mean, I suppose the other thing is it intrigues me is we're involved in sustainable natural materials. But when you were building your passive house, there was very little acknowledgement within the institute about the use of natural materials. You could build a passive house out of nuclear waste, concrete, and steel, and still get a badge on the outside. Yeah. And now, but now, it always struck me as odd. I can remember talking to people about this some years ago, saying, "Hang on a minute, this just from my ignorant point of view, the more efficient you make the house, the more you concentrate the pollution into the fabric. Surely we should be." And yours is built out of yours is a natural. You're all wood fiber and timber construction, aren't you? On your one,
above ground, yeah. I mean, below
above
ground,
ground.
yeah, below ground it's concrete and polystyrene, but yeah,
Some of which I think is forgivable. But are you seeing? Are you seeing when you talk to passive designers? Are you seeing more natural material being used now than you were then? Is there a shift towards this kind of thinking, or is energy efficiency still the holy grail?
I think it is, and there's still that's the one. Well, that's one of the areas that we work on particularly now is understanding that U value is not the whole picture. You know, there's because of all the other points that you guys have raised.
Single metric building, please no.
Yeah, it doesn't work. You can't get an understanding of how comfortable a building is going to be just by looking at the U value. And actually, you know, I did have a short email conversation with Wolfgang Feist, and he acknowledged that, you know, in temperate climates like this, you really do need to look at the thermal mass of the materials that you're using and how they can buffer the sort of heat gains and everything inside the building and heat storage inside the building. So, you know, there is an understanding that these kind of materials can benefit you, but I mean, passive house is an energy standard primarily, not a sort of material.
Maybe that's part of the resistance, or that people think it's more than that. People think that it's
cost, isn't it? If you get U value with, you know, 300 mil of glass fiber, why would you want to use wood fiber, which is probably twice the cost, or 50% more, or whatever it is? You know, without understanding that the decrement delay in that fiberglass is 3 hours instead of 18 hours, which means that your house is going to get really toasty on a hot day, whereas the wood fiber stays nice and comfortable.
That's a really good, interesting point, because if you're talking to architects about the numbers and this knowledge transfer that's going on, where you can work on a highly technical level, surely this will actually flush this out at that stage where you or presuming they run phase shift calculations, okay, because if they don't, they're not going to notice it.
Well, that's it. I mean, I don't think necessarily that there is that level of understanding generally. I mean, certainly with specific architects, there absolutely is, and you know, over time there are more and more, and again, they tend to be the younger practices who are really looking at this. And
well, most of the architects' practices that we both deal with know most of this. You know, no, it's the ones I'm interested in, the ones who don't really. You know, it is
influence and sort of osmosis will kind of, you know, work its way through. But it's a slow, gradual thing. You can't, and as with anything, it takes time for changes to happen, doesn't it? I mean, you know, you could argue we don't have the time, but that's the way it is.
But I mean, the other thing is that I think that just as we begin to wind down our little session together, which has been lovely, thank you. But it's about reframing it some way. But I mean, one of the things that we're looking at is since we've been together. I mean, since we started, Eco Merchant started the same time as you, late 90s. We've had this constant technical emphasis the whole time. Everything has been a technical sell, and after all this time, we've all experienced reasonably good growth. It's relatively consistent, you know, so 10-15% a year is not unreasonable to expect, and not unreasonable to achieve in good years.
Yeah.
But I just think I part of what I enjoy talking to you about, Chris, is the next stage. I think possibly is a reframing, so we don't lose any of that, but we add to it by describing this in a slightly different way. Okay, and I think that's probably the next bit. So if we are thinking that way, where do you see us going over the next sort of, you know, where are we next when we're moving into try and expand the uptake of sustainable natural building materials and systems?
Well, that's why we're going through the Agrimon process with some of our products, is to try and mainstream them effectively, to give the mainstream companies the confidence to specify that product. It's got the warranties I need, tick. You know, can we include it in our project, tick. You know, and actually and increase the offering. But again, that's why we've kind of designed it as we've designed it, so that the way that it is installed is not a barrier to entry as well, so that it's using familiar materials, it's using familiar processes. So I think as people become more trained in using some of these materials, it will grow. But equally, as people produce systems which are, effectively more palatable to the mainstream, then again, that will help. The Baumet products, they're really highly engineered products, and some of them even contain cement, which is literally,
white cement, in fairness, quite often.
well, sometimes, not always, but again, understanding that, that it's still actually very vapor permeable, and actually as vapor permeable, if not more vapor permeable than lime plasters. But getting that in a bag, giving it to a contractor, they can cope with that. They don't need to know all the other stuff. It's palatable.
Are we brave enough to do any advertising that basically says so simple even a builder could do it in some sort of awful non-PC way?
I think
I take your point. I remember we wrote a piece about lime years ago when we started work with lime green, which was the just add water approach. You get a technical heritage product which has been expertly made in a factory, and it's incredibly consistent. It's pretty inexpensive. And actually, it goes on the float, goes on the hawk like a good plaster. 20 minutes, you'll be an expert. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think we undersell it. Maybe we're a bit shy about doing that, Chris. And, maybe we should be adding to the technical stuff a little bit more with some of this.
I think so. Like I say, there's a lot of products, and a lot of these products have a lot of the kind of natural materials are being produced in a modern format. Again, you don't need to know that it's what it's made of necessarily, but it's in a format that anybody can use, so that the barrier or potential barrier to perceived barrier to entry is not that builders can't use it. It's either in the mindset of the designer, or that the designer can't necessarily see where the cost window needs to start and finish. Again, because if you just look at material costs, you might say, oh well, that's too expensive to use. If you expand it out to include a period of occupancy time, you might find that actually it's cheaper to use these natural materials.
I agree with you. It's a bane of our lives. And this is where I go back to the shareholder thing, which is quite often you're satisfying the requirements of somebody who's not going to live and occupy in the building, which is one of the reasons why I know both your business and our business do quite well with housing associations, because they have that longer term view.
Yeah.
It's more difficult to sell it. We're kind of getting towards the end of this. There's a whole section here on this which we could expand on, and also getting into other restrictions and things that limit us, things like building control, which we haven't even mentioned, thank goodness. But it is. So I think that I don't know. We're just going to keep going, aren't we? We've got to work out a few ways. I think it would be nice to have a few angles. I think I want to steal some of your stuff, Chris, with your approach.
You mentioned building control. Building control, we don't find a problem, because all the evidence and all the data is there. That's the benefit of actually getting all the data before you try and sell a product, is you've already got the answers that building control needs.
I was thinking of it from the other side, which is people will hide behind it and use an excuse.
Okay.
But Chris, we're coming to the end. At the end of every time I have someone on to these, I ask them 3 questions, and so I've got the 3 for you just to round this off. I always ask people to recommend a good read, something that, or a book or article or resource that had an impact on you, a little sort of light bulb moment where you went, is there anything you can think of?
I struggled with that one. I mean, there were sort of books that, as I say, sort of finding that cob and earth construction had been scientifically researched was kind of pivotal. But in the sort of broader term, discussing all of this with people who have no knowledge of it is actually my kind of light bulb moment, because it's so easy to be bound up in the technicalities of it and all of the stuff that we deal with. Forgetting to stick your head above the parapet actually is my light bulb moment.
You need to get out more is the bit of advice.
Well, there is that, But finding people around you like that can look at it from the outside with no knowledge of anything actually is more my light bulb moment, rather than a book or something like that. And having the input, we've had Charlie Martin from Gusto. We've worked with him for absolute years, and he's so good because he he just comes at it from the outside.
Yeah, no, I think
And
that's
he's young and he's full of creativity, and that's the kind of thing that really helps is having that sort of exuberance. So if there was a book that could teach me that, that would be great. But
I think I might be able to find you one. I was going to ask you as well. The three things I ask you, the second one is about a bit of advice, but I think you've kind of just given it, which is get out there, because the way you see yourself or the way you think you see yourself might not be how others see you, and their view of you might be entirely plausible and
that's
more
true.
accurate than yours.
But being in a niche actually is that bit of advice. You know,
That's the one you want to give, yeah.
when I started, you know, you want to be able to cater for everybody, and you just think, you know, I've got to be able to cater for everybody because you can't possibly turn down work, whatever. But as time goes on, the more you focus on a specific thing, the more you get known for that specific thing, but also the better at it you get, and the better at it, better at, I don't know, solving the issues become. So yeah, I think being in a niche and refining your niche and really understanding your niche is actually that.
I mean, I'm just going to chuck this in. Probably haven't got time for it, but it reminds me of a lovely advert which says exactly that. And it was for Gordon's gin, who really, you know, most people think Gordon's, they think gin. Their advert was it said basically it was a selection of a butterfly collection. And they were all bent pins and broken butterflies. And it said at the top, Jeff Cape's butterfly collection, you know. And basically, if you're going to be good at one thing, be good at one thing. That's really good advice. I think that's marvelous. And the last question I asked people, you've already answered, which was really the one moment in your career. That was when boredom struck and you left the lab and went on to site, which was
absolutely. Oh, is that me? Oh no. Oh no.
No, it's not you. It's Will.
Oh.
He's let me just come off video.
It looks like he's had a power cut. The light's gone out.
Yeah, just the power's back on again now, which is great. So apologies, everybody, if we're there. Chris, I presume we're still recording and we're still going. But listen, thank you so much. It's been great having you on.
Great to talk to you. No, thank you. That was a great session.